The cloud came closer and closer, until the barrier became completely covered with dirt. It was a very strange sight indeed for their welcoming party to observe sand hanging in mid-air sticking to something they couldn't see. As for the visitors, they could not see much through the sand, so Eric loosed his hold on Finola and Franklin's hands and sent a wave of sound through the bubble that made a ripple, effectively shaking the particles of sand off and clearing their view. Once it was clear, though, he wished he could replace it. The things sitting in front of them were so horrifyingly ugly, he didn't want to see any more. Staring down at them from the top of a very large tank-shaped vehicle were visions straight out of a nightmare. Pale grey skin flopped loosely about the spare frames of these medium-sized beings. Their features were hard to describe because there weren't many. Sunken dark sockets set in their faces showed no signs of eyes of any kind. Yet the humans knew they were indeed being looked at. The creatures' mouths were similarly set, being a dark formless hole with no visible tongue or teeth. The bodies that these ugly heads sat on were, likewise, just as disturbing, with joints attached randomly to limbs at odd angles. Broken pieces stuck on carelessly with super glue. One being's neck had what appeared to be a shoulder protruding from it where one might expect to find a collarbone. Further down the arm, the elbow seemed to be stuck on backward, the angle of the bone pointing in toward the thing's waist, or whatever that lump was at its center. Each monstrous image had different, painfully impossible arrangements that passed for body parts. How they moved at all was a miracle as far as Eric was concerned. But move they did, and rather well, despite their deformities, jumping down from their tall metal transport to land on the sand, a horrible grating sound emitting from their tortured joints. Finola counted 15 gross individuals in all. 5 had stayed on top of the dull brown tank, while the others paced around the barrier studying it. She didn't know whether they were curious or merely cautious. They stayed a few feet away, pacing in a loose circle, black pits pointed in their direction. Even though their mouths, or black holes in their faces, didn't seem to be moving, she knew they were communicating with each other somehow. Twisted bodies turned toward each other in response to a silent word. Working on a hunch, she turned her hearing inwards, looking for a mental pathway they might be using. At first, she picked up only incoherent mumbles in her head. Concentrating a little harder, she managed to fine-tune the connection, picking up words from one of the creatures. "They are like the other one." A voice that sounded like gargling rang through her head. "Yes, quite hideous, aren't they?" Another voice responded as their greeting party moved their unsightly frames around the bubble. "Could be a lot of profit in it for us if we could get them back to Shrell. How do you think we can get to them?" Black Pits stared intently at the barrier as one of the monsters approached, walking on feet that were attached backwards, toes pointing towards its butt. A grey hand reached up to run its thumb, located in the middle of its palm, over the silky shield. Alice responded by moving the entire group to a position outside the circle of uglies. That's what her name was for the things. As they landed on the sand, Alice lost her concentration for a second and the barrier slipped. The deformed welcoming committee quickly overcame their surprise and was on them in a flash, rubbery flesh hands with fingers all in the wrong places, grabbed roughly at them, bruising arms, pulling at hair. Franklin set several of them on fire as he lifted one of the brutes and threw him off Alice. The ugly landed on the ground with a satisfying crunch but picked itself off the ground and ran at the group again. To Franklin's dismay, the ones he set on fire simply patted the flames down and continued their approach. It was so hot out here already, apparently the fire was nothing to them. A rank smell filled the air as burnt flesh smoldered on gummy arms. Finola's screams ripped through the air as one of the creatures dragged her to the large metal vehicle by her hair. She was helpless at this time, the powers that she possessed being useless in this arid atmosphere. She was giving them a run for their money, powers or not, pulling and hitting at every exposed body part she could. Limbs popped and she even managed to grab one of her attacker's arms. It snapped off at the elbow joint easily enough. It was attached so haphazardly, and went flying across the field to land at Franklin's feet. Franklin picked it up with twisted lips forming a silent U and proceeded to take out two of his attackers by clubbing them viciously with it. His eyes lighting up with satisfaction, he knocked one clumsily situated head off its shoulders and set it sailing through the air to disappear in the sand. Eric ran toward Finola, his fine white skin blistering up rapidly as his personal shield slipped. Alice was so occupied fending off her attackers that she had forgotten the first rule in combat: maintain control. Reaching inside herself and blocking out the pain of having her arm yanked behind her, she transported herself to Eric's side. Running alongside him, she enveloped him in the protective film once again. Unfortunately, she had also transported the thing that was with her. It ran with her, easily catching hold of her and pulling her toward the transport. Her skin was getting so hot now. She cringed as the enemy's fingers roughly gripped her arm, scraping against her second-degree sunburn. She had to get them covered soon. She turned her head to see Finola still struggling against her attacker. Her dark skin flushed as she too felt the effects of the hot sun. Ignoring her pain, Alice drove her elbow sharply backwards, grunting in satisfaction as she heard her enemy's bones break. Her unplanned attachment fell back, hitting the sand hard. Bones broke this time too, but to her horror, the thing got up anyway. The fingers that fell off its hand and into the sand wiggled through the powdery stuff in an effort to rejoin the body it fell from. Though they seemed to be able to beat the ugly terrors back, they couldn't seem to keep them down. Already broken pieces seemed to be on the mend. Parts torn away were seeking their owners, attaching themselves at will, not necessarily in the right place, but certainly on the right body. That's why they look the way they do, Alice thought dully, continuing to fight her way through two more of the fiends to get to Finola's side. Finola, for her part, even though she was shorter than the whole group, Uglies included, was doing an excellent job of clearing a path to Alice. The two girls met, grabbing at each other's arms and holding tightly. Alice put up a barrier that effectively stopped the attackers from coming any closer. She looked around anxiously for her two friends, crying out in anguish when she saw Franklin and Eric being herded into the vehicle.